Okay, so here we're going to talk about some compression, and in particular, some drum compression, and in particular, again, the snare drum top. So let's listen to the snare drum top part in context with the rest of the band. Now let's listen to it soloed. All right, it sounds fine. Now, why do we need drum compression anyway if it already sounds fine? Well, essentially this is the reason. If you look at these snare hits, they're quite inconsistent, which in fact is fine because you don't want it to all sound exactly the same. But what we want to do is we want to just take down some of the louder hits and bring up some of the softer hits so that it's a little bit more equal. So there's not quite as much dynamic range. So effectively what we're doing is reducing the dynamic range or compressing the dynamic range, hence the use of the word compressor. So let's open up our compressor that we're going to use here. And you'll notice that all of the defaults are really quite sensible. They're good defaults. Essentially, we've got a ratio of 3:1, which is a reasonable amount of compression without going too far. Our threshold is set at -24, which is usually where these things need to take effect. Our makeup gain is not put in there at all, and we've got a fairly smart attack time, and I'll explain why in a moment. So let's talk about these settings. First of all, the threshold's the first important one. That is at what point the compressor is going to start compressing the sound. So if we look at the waveform up here, the -24 might be around about here. That would mean that this sound here is going to be compressed, but this sound here won't be compressed, which is fine because that's a softer one and this is a louder one. Okay, so it's only going to grab the top of these things and compress them, possibly some of these as well. If this sound, if all of these sounds were too soft, I could lower the threshold. If they were really loud and I only wanted to grab the top of those loud sounds, I could raise the threshold. So I'm going to leave that at -24 for now because it's a pretty good threshold setting. Now the ratio itself, for something that has got some strong transients, such as we've got here, that has got some fairly snappy, quick sounds, we need to use a reasonable amount of compression, but not getting ahead of ourselves too far. So I'm going to actually set this at 4, at a ratio of 4:1. So that means that for every one sound that goes through, it's actually going to only allow a quarter of that sound through. So if we divide that into 4 parts, it's only going to let one of those parts through. Now, for an instrument like the bass, you actually want to have a more consistent volume of sound coming from the bass guitar, whereas with the drums, you want to have a little bit more variation in the volume of the drum hits. So that's why we're only going to apply a mild amount of compression, between about 2 and 4, whereas with the bass you would actually apply a little bit more compression because you want to smooth it out a bit more. So you might have between about 4 and 6 there. Anything over about 8 is a lot of compression. I mean the scale goes up to 100, which is maximum compression or limiting, but anything about above about 8 or 10 is actually a fair bit of compression. So we're going to set that on about 4 there. All right, so that's that one set. Now, as we compress the sound, we need to raise the volume of the entire track. That will allow the softer sounds to be heard a little bit better, and that's what our makeup gain is for. So I'm just going to set my makeup gain about 2 decibels there at that point. Okay, so threshold, ratio, and gain done. Let's have a listen to those. I'm going to take the bypass off, and we'll have a listen to it with the bypass on and off as I toggle it through. Let's listen to it with the bypass and with the bypass off. It's very, very subtle, but it is actually pulling down the tops a little bit more. I want you to experiment with that and have a very careful listen to the sound. Now, let's talk about the attack time. The attack time essentially is how long it takes for the compression to actually take hold. So why would we need attack time? Do we not just want to compress the top end of the sound that we're trying to compress? Well, I've got a little graphic here that I'm going to show you that hopefully will explain that. If you can imagine that the sound, this is the sound here, the sound travels through here, and as it hits the threshold, it compresses. But if we didn't compress the sound, it would keep going on this trajectory. Right? It would keep getting louder. Now, I've got a little waveform here that I'm going to insert at that point, and you can see that essentially the sound gets louder. Now, if you can imagine, as it goes through the threshold, we don't want it to compress straight away because the loudest part of the sound is actually a little bit further on. So if we compressed it straight away, we wouldn't actually hear any of this sound up here, or at least all of that would sound the same volume. So that's the reason that we need to give it a little bit of time before it actually kicks in straight away. So when we're talking about attack times, 10 milliseconds is a pretty intelligent attack time. It's not too fast, but it's also not too slow to let too much of that hit actually get through. So you might consider a fast attack time around about 3 to 4 milliseconds. A very fast attack time would be 1 millisecond, and I would probably suggest that you not go below about 2 milliseconds in terms of the attack time. There's all sorts of reasons for that. Essentially, you're not going to get any of that initial hit, and it could well be compressing every single top of every single cycle that's actually playing. Anyway, I can go into that another time. So essentially, what we've got here is a fairly fast attack time at about, say, 3 to 1. And the reason we need a fast attack time here is because the transients are really quite strong. If we were working with a vocalist or a bass player, then our transients aren't quite as strong, so we would have to back off on that release time, the attack time a little bit. All right, so back off on the attack time for a vocalist or a bass player or something that doesn't have quite as strong transients. Let's have a listen to what this sounds like at 3 to 1 now. Now I'm going to bypass that. And again. I think you can probably hear the difference there. I recommend that you experiment with that one there, not going too low though. Now, in terms of the release time, so when the sound travels back through the threshold, then you want the compression to stop compressing the sound. So you want to turn it off effectively. But if you turn it off too quick, what happens is the sound can then suddenly pop up and get louder again. And that will sound very unnatural. So we need to have a fairly slow release time, just so that if there's another sound that happens after that, and we want that compressed as well, then it's going to already have that compression applied if it's directly after it. But of course, we need the release time to be slow enough so that it's not compressing that one and that one in the same motion of attack. We need the release time to release before this next transient comes in. So we need to just adjust that release time. So a very fast release time would be something similar to the attack time, about 10 milliseconds. That would actually be a fast release time. A fairly sensible release time would be around about the default, which is 80 milliseconds. But for a vocalist, you might actually increase the release time a little bit more, around about the 120 milliseconds. So that's essentially those 5 controls. Now the knee is going to actually adjust how much before the threshold, before the sound hits the threshold, does it start to apply the compression. So that's another one that you might want to fiddle with. Certainly for a vocalist, you want to have a mild knee. For a drum kit, you're going to have quite a hard knee. And so hopefully that helps with setting the compression for certainly your drums, but also considering the bass and the vocals as well. Good luck.